If not for the writer Luke, we would be without many of the small details of Jesus' ministry, and more than that, we would be without the history of the beginning of the Christian congregation. So while we owe it to Luke for preserving this information for us, we also owe a debt of gratitude to someone else, the often overlooked and very enigmatic Theophilus. Now, there are a lot of theories out there about who Theophilus was, if he was a person or if he was a group of people. But for this episode, we are doing a deep dive on the theory that not only was Theophilus a real individual, but he was actually the Apostle Paul's lawyer for the first trial at Rome. And you might be surprised on how a deep dive into Roman law and lawyers may shed light on why Luke wrote his books the way he did and how he did. The first thing that people often note when reading the Gospel of Luke is the detail-oriented nature of the book. And the reason for this lies in the very purpose of the writing, which is found in the first few verses. That Theophilus, despite being told about Jesus' ministry orally, needed something not just written, but detailed accounts, thoroughly researched for accuracy, and with the testimony of eyewitnesses. So the usual theory that Theophilus was just an interested person and maybe a dignitary kind of falls apart here, because it sure doesn't show humility on his part, right? He's not a humble person if he's demanding that the oral account isn't good enough for him. In the book of Acts, we have many dignitaries that accepted the Christian teachings without demanding written certification of these events. So why would Luke see the need to go through all these efforts and provide this in-depth certification for the oral teachings of the congregation? It would have been an immense amount of work, and when you look at the timeline as to when the pressure was on for Luke to provide this, it seems to land in the time of Luke being with Paul, traveling to Rome and being in Rome awaiting trial. So it lends itself to the theory that this could have been designed as a sworn affidavit. And really, the gospel was only the first half of, you could say, the same book, kind of part one, part two. Although we slide John's gospel between the two, as far as Theophilus was concerned, the gospel was the first part of what he received from Luke, and Acts of the Apostle was the second part. So now let's consider the book Acts of the Apostles. Again, the first question we have is, why does someone in the congregation, like Theophilus, need this book? Why does their faith depend on knowing what happened in the early congregation and what Paul was up to on his missionary tours? This doesn't matter to anybody unless it directly relates to your work or assignment, right? And when we examine the theme, Acts of the Apostles, First, we have to realize that this wasn't the name of the book according to Luke or Theophilus. This name comes from Irenaeus in the late 2nd century CE. When we look at it, it's really not about the apostles, though, is it? It's about Paul. Think, after Pentecost 33 CE, what happens to Matthew, Simon, Bartholomew, Thomas, any of the apostles? What really happens to them? We don't actually know, because the book Acts of the Apostles doesn't talk about what the apostles do and where they went and what happened to them. So we have a little bit of information about Peter and John, but it's largely from Paul's letters that we learn about what was happening with the other apostles. It's from Peter's letters. It's from John's letters that we learn about these things. It's not from Acts of the Apostles. Really, when we break down the book, we can see that the first 7 chapters could be considered as a needed narrative to help Paul's lawyer possibly understand how, after Jesus' death, the congregation and governing body was formed, how they were organized, how they functioned. Luke gives specific examples in these early chapters of how this governing body appointed responsible men and what the qualifications were, how they handled finances, how they carried out relief work to help people, how they viewed very seriously the making of vows and oaths and being honest. We also have examples of legal precedents that were being set regarding Peter and John, who were acquitted by the Supreme Court of Judea for these same charges Paul was now facing. We are then introduced to Paul as a former worker of that Jewish high court, who was at the time filled with hate and violence and willing to carry out possibly even unlawful beatings and death sentences before changing his life over and becoming the man of peace that he was now known as. But of course, if Acts of the Apostles is for the court, then wouldn't the court want to know, so why is Paul preaching to Greeks? Isn't this a Jewish thing? But don't worry, because the book explains for us the role of Philip the evangelizer, John, and Peter in opening up first the Samaritan field, and then the Gentile field with a trusted Roman officer, Cornelius. But then we have Barnabas introduced to us. Why? Why does the court need to know about Barnabas? Because he served as an early character witness to Paul and was his initial mentor in areas of relief work and preaching. We then learn of what happened to Herod Agrippa, who falsely condemned James and imprisoned Peter. And from there we follow Paul's journey to Roman imprisonment without deviating into what any other apostle or disciple is doing during that time, because it is not about them, it's about Paul. So even while Luke is in Philippi for 5 years, we don't really learn about that because the story is focused on Paul's work. It focuses on Roman officials who accepted Paul as an honest witness, like Sergius Paulus of Paphos. We have Dionysius of Athenian Areopagus judges. We also have Publius of Malta, We then have preserved for us the verdicts and conversations with Governor Festus and King Agrippa. We then have the Council of Philippi, who had become fearful because they wrongfully flogged and imprisoned a Roman citizen in Paul without charges. We also have the detail of the proconsul Galileo, who recognized the charges were false against Paul but refused involvement. And as Paul arrives in Rome for trial, what happens to the story? It stops. Why? Because it's rolled up and put into the hand of Theophilus. That's where the story ends. So why would this man need all these details recorded in this book? Why does someone of faith need to know what the apostles, and specifically Paul, was up to the last few years? Well, now let's examine the process of defending Paul before the forum. Just like being a doctor, nobody needed a license or had to attend law school or really undergo any sort of formal, organized instruction in order to be a lawyer. In fact, most Roman lawyers would have considered that to be beneath them anyways. So how did you learn the trade then if you wanted to be a lawyer? Well, observation and imitation of your more experienced colleagues, meaning that at least a few times a week you would accompany your master to the forum, closely watch them perform there, and really learn the spirit and essence of the Roman law and how it worked. So, unlike being a doctor, being a lawyer was very prestigious work, and initially it was reserved only for the aristocratic class or the upper class of society. And this could be why, if Theophilus is a lawyer, Luke regards him with the term most excellent Theophilus, because being a lawyer is something reserved for those in respected positions of society. Now that said, very few, if any, Romans actually devoted themselves full-time or exclusively to the practice of law, especially in the early days. And that's because it was a hobby. In fact, from the early beginnings of the Roman Republic, a lawyer actually was not supposed to receive money for their work in law. It was considered a public service, so to be paid for it was an abuse of the office and even corruption of power. So why did you become a lawyer then? Well, basically, you enjoyed winning arguments. So if you're looking for a lawyer for Paul, you're looking for someone who loves to win. By the 1st century, many non-aristocrats had begun jumping into the law profession because they saw this was a great way to not just make money, but also fame and prestige. The example of Cicero and Crassus are examples of men who saw this opportunity, started out poor, and became many times a millionaire because of their practice. But if you're looking for a lawyer for an apostle, you don't really want someone who's been corrupted chasing after money and fame. You want someone old school, someone that believes the law should be the way it used to be done. So somebody who only works for tips, or maybe simply just appreciation, or maybe even someone that's just enthusiastic about the cause. So your ideal lawyer for the Apostle Paul would be interested in Christianity before he took the case. Someone who already believed Paul was in the right and was willing and eager to argue it before this forum, simply for the pleasure of knowing he was rendering a valuable service to people he loved. Luke indicates that Theophilus was already acquainted with the teachings of Jesus. So then, why exactly was Matthew's gospel not good enough for Theophilus? And why was a rundown on Paul's life and early Christianity required for him? Well, simply put, he needed to prepare the case. A statute was enacted which limited the number of lawyers a person could have on their case, and this was because things were starting to get a little out of control. That's because the focus was often on prestige. Therefore, lawyers didn't want to collaborate with each other. So, the first one would go up, give a detailed statement, sometimes hours long, and then when he was done, the next lawyer would go up and give a near exact same defense, but his way, so it was better. And it became exhausting. In the defense case of a man named Marina, Cicero complained of the difficulties of working with his two co-counsels, Crassus and Hortensius. He said that the two lawyers had so thoroughly covered the issues, they left him nothing to argue, so he just went up and covered it all again, but his way. However, when this happened, a lot of cases saw that the critical issues were skipped over and not dealt with because each of the advocates focused on the dramatics and expected the other person to cover the kind of more boring facts of the case. And because they didn't collaborate, that meant important issues got skipped, and sometimes speeches had no connection with each other. People couldn't follow what the argument actually was being made in the case. So the other result that happened from these long-winded speeches is some judges began placing time limits on each advocate by using a water glass or water clock. So when the timer ran out, the advocate was told to sit down, you're finished. And oftentimes you were not told in advance how long the water clock was set for. So with little to no advance notice, Theophilus would need to be prepared for every situation. So if the judge wanted a succinct trial, he needed to sum things up and just give an overview of the events, which could be why Luke's accounts are not just detail-oriented, but also chronological in manner. So, if time was allowed, he could give the details, but otherwise, a simple order of events was enough. And everything from who Jesus was, to what Christians teach, to how exactly did Paul end up here in Rome anyways. Unlike today, the focus of a lawyer in Rome was not about determining guilt or innocence. It was more about this. In light of the alleged facts, what ought to be done according to the law? And so, sometimes it was simply about determining if a punishment is even required for what was done, and if so, what is that punishment? So this meant there were often theatrics involved with arguing the case. One of the more famous ones was Mark Antony prosecuting Julius Caesar's assassins. In it, he held up Julius Caesar's bloodied toga and pointed to the cuts by the daggers on it. Oftentimes, if there was a murder that had taken place, the lawyer would reenact during the trial the murder scene in all the gruesome details so that the judge could hear the onlookers' cries for revenge as it played out on the stage. And this was because oftentimes in these trials, it was open to the public. And so theatrics, animated delivery, this was all part of it because if you could sway the crowd on your side, it meant you could possibly sway the judge. Now, we can imagine Theophilus then reenacting some of Paul's life. Maybe it was the unlawful beating in Philippi by the city council, pointing to the crowd and saying, "It could be you next time you're in Philippi." Maybe it was his work to save the army officers and the Roman citizens from shipwreck and possible death off of Malta. Maybe it was his work to dramatically expose and condemn the corrupt advisor to the proconsul in Paphos. Whatever it was, when we picture Theophilus, we don't picture a shy, timid man. This was an extravagant man with a booming voice that could carry unamplified throughout the theater. As the time for the trial approached, we can imagine the veritable who's who that showed up here in Rome to help out, whether it's giving testimony or maybe even serving as a co-counsel alongside Theophilus. We can think of Mark, who was not only with Paul on the Judean relief work and the tour through Cyprus, but was an eyewitness to the events for the proconsul. We have Timothy, who witnessed not just the beatings in Lystra that Paul endured, but it was also alongside him for the second and third tours. We have Tychicus and Aristarchus, who were with Paul during the Ephesus riots. We have Priscilla and Aquila, who were from Rome, perhaps knew quite a few of the higher class people that lived in the city, and were alongside Paul for the events of Corinth and Ephesus. We also have Demas, who likely witnessed the riots of Thessaloniki. Epaphras was next. Likely he was alongside Paul for much of Asia Minor, perhaps the events of Troas he witnessed. Epaphroditus may have witnessed the beatings of Philippi and imprisonment. Paul's relatives, Andronicus, Junius, and Herodian, could have attested to Paul's former life, as they were here in Rome as well. And even Titus may have shown up in the city to testify on Paul's behalf for his love for the uncircumcised Greek. Though the details of the case and even Theophilus himself are lost to history, we can imagine that this would have been a spectacle, an amazing event to witness, as this high-profile case came before one of the most high-profile emperors, Nero. And that meant the judge would hear the onlookers' cries for revenge as it played out on stage. I kind of rambled it. And if there was a murder that had played out, this would literally play out on... Okay. Are you sure the sun's okay?
That one. We filmed this episode at Ostia because we needed somewhere quiet and scenic, and of course Rome is just way too busy. So we took the 30-minute train out to this beautiful archaeological site. It had just rained the day before, so you get those bright colors. It was a really nice place to film the episode.
And that was the real key, is a quiet place, because we needed to stay focused while filming the monologues, because it's very detail-oriented in nature with the script and research. And the research is not new research. I've had this storyline in my back pocket from years before we started Taste and See TV. This is a theory that's intrigued me for at least 15 years. I've heard of this theory. So it was we're happy to finally be able to put this, shall we say, in print on an episode, put the theory out there to a bit of a wider audience. I think it's fascinating. I think it's credible. Not everyone will agree, but it's an interesting deep dive into Roman law, which a lot of the research of this came from, I think it's Cambridge University, has done quite a few papers on Roman law, and so it's very interesting. But yeah, we needed a quiet place. Ostia is a beautiful place to do that, and it's not to say in the episode that Theophilus lived in Ostia, or that the congregation was based out of Ostia. That's in Rome. Ostia was just the port city of Rome. There's a connection to it. It's where a lot of wealthy people lived and a lot of rich people lived in Ostia and made their business there, and there was a Jewish community there. But Theophilus lived in Rome, very likely, as did the rest of the congregation. But this was just more for the quiet, scenic place to film. So just to make that clear. And hopefully you enjoyed the episode and the research, and we'll see you in the next episode.